Hello and welcome to Africa Today. I am Esther Mopariola. East versus West, China versus India, and all you have is an evolving scramble for Africa where abundant resources beats effective resourcefulness. From being a basket case region in the dark to becoming a continent of hope, enjoying impressive economic growth, Africa often stands the risk of being tagged a partially owned subsidiary of China. And so we ask, what are your thoughts on China's bilateral relations and growing influence in Africa? You can join the conversation and share your thoughts with us on Twitter at TVC News NG. We take a report now, and Africa Today will be right back. Welcome on board.
Ethiopia is among China's comprehensive strategic cooperation partners in several sectors, including the Belt and Road Initiative. The Ethiopian Prime Minister El-Mariam Desalegn says the country is able to rapidly grow its economy due to the strong and excellent relationship both countries have.
First of all, you know that China and Ethiopia are one of the leading countries in terms of global economic growth. Ethiopia has moved very fast in economic growth, and we learned this from China, and simply China has shown a very strong growth and economic development and social development in China. So I think this has brought up very good relations between our two countries.
The Ethiopia-China relationship is focused in major areas like trade and investment, with many Chinese companies investing in the country, helping to develop Ethiopia's infrastructure deficit.
This also shows we need a strong cooperation, partnership, and a strong relationship between our two countries. Chinese development is people-centered, and it focuses on unleashing the potential of the people and using the creative minds of all the people and making conducive environment for the people to discharge its full potential in development. That is the best way we can learn from. By then you will have a shared growth which trickles down to each and every individual in the society.
Many Chinese companies have also invested in Ethiopia, solving the local unemployment problems and helping its economic growth.
Welcome back. Decades ago, China's influence in Africa was limited until the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation was established in year 2000. By 2009, China had grown to become the largest trading partner on the continent, importing large quantities of resources and investing huge sums in social and infrastructural development. Joining me in the studio on Africa Today, I have Professor Anthony Killer, Center Director at the Center for International Advanced and Professional Studies. And on the phone, I have Hei Tang, Assistant Professor of International Economics at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies in the United States. Good to have you gentlemen on the program.
Thank you for having me.
Now let's look at the relationship between China and Africa. Let me start with you now, Professor Killer. The relationship dates back as far as 202 BC and 220 AD. But the Sino-African relationships came back, dates back as far as 1950s, where we have the relations with Senegal, with Algeria, with Egypt, and all of that. But looking at today, what are your thoughts on the relationship between China and Africa in this present time, between then and now?
And now, I think you're looking at two different worlds totally. Let us focus on the present one, these contemporary times. It's a new development, which in a way is quite foreseeable and almost inevitable that this kind of development will happen this way. China is sort of the new emerging power, global power. It has money, it has people, and it needs energy, and it needs land. So in a way, and it needs a place for its people to expand to. And in a way, Africa fits that bill very well. So the relationship is almost an inevitable match, as it were. So you have to look at it that way. I guess the question we tend to ask in this kind of relationship, or in this kind of situation, is, who's losing and who's winning Is Africa getting the best out of it or not? And I think that's what's on people's mind, and I'm sure that's what on your mind as well. So we'll get
Indeed,
that
because
gradually.
that has been the conversation for some time. They say that China seems to gain more than Africa gaining out of this. But let me throw that question to Hai Wei, who is joining me via phone. How would you describe the relationship between Africa and China, even though some say it isn't all that win-win situation, as it were?
So, as an economist, I would say international trade is mostly good for both continents. This is true for Chinese investment in Africa. This is true also for African workers and African firms who may benefit from Chinese investment and Chinese international trade. So what I have to say is, China has come out from poverty in the last 3 decades. It had a lot of experience about how to industrialize its economy and how to take advantage of international trade to move the country up the value chain. So all this kind of experience may benefit some of the African trade partners. So I'm not saying that there's no controversy about the China-Africa relationship. The controversy is clear. Some of the companies, some of the countries' governments are afraid of losing jobs or deindustrialize their economies. But I think there could be complementary policies that individual African nations can adopt in order to benefit from the Chinese economic engagement in the continent.
So how are you able to deal with that criticisms that you often get, that China isn't really, benefiting the African continent, as it were?
So if I understand your question correctly, how countries can benefit from this economic engagement?
Not exactly. How is China handling the criticisms it faces that it isn't really benefiting Africa? That its cooperation with Africa isn't really beneficial?
So, a very common perception about Chinese economic motives in Africa is to extract raw materials and natural resources. That is certainly part of the story. Certain countries like Angola and Sudan and Congo are probably providing a lot of raw materials to China. But at the same time, China has already hit the so-called middle income trap in the sense that it is an aging economy. The cost of labor has been increasing quite a lot. So we started seeing more manufacturing investment from China to Africa. So that could be an opportunity for some nations in Africa to industrialize their economies.
All right, let me quickly come to you now, Professor Akila. With all that you've said, China seems to be more endeared to Africa, to most African countries than the West.
Yeah.
But my question is, what really makes them so, preferred? Not pro, as in preferred than the Western countries like the United States, Britain, and all that. What really makes China, the best among the lot?
Well, it's not, because they're different. That's the way to look at it.
Exactly.
I mean, the first thing is that up till about 30 years ago, when China was looking inwards and was dealing with its own poverty, it wasn't an option on the field. So they have come as international players late, and hence they tend to offer more and ask less questions. So that has made African leaders look towards them. Now, let us look at it this way. The first thing to say is that this is good for Africa in the sense that it creates options. Because before, Africans will only go towards the West for industrialization, for partnership, and sadly, even for aids, for donation.
Indeed.
So having another block, which is available there, option is always good to have. As we say, it's always better to be able to than to want to. So having option is good. Is the relationship slightly dangerous? Yes, it can be dangerous. Is there a risk of another colonialism? Yes, there is a risk. But then, we should be very clear about this. Even 2017, going towards 2018, any country in Africa allowed itself to be colonized, it has itself to blame. Because in reality, there is nothing new that can come out of international relationship anymore. If African leaders are so daft or so selfish to allow another party to colonize them now, then they have themselves to blame. Sadly, there are too many interests that are not exactly, that does not coincide with the national interest of the country. And this has allowed certain things to happen, certain bad things to happen. But it shouldn't be a worry, because overall, The way the world is going now, private partnership is going to play more. If there's anything we should be telling African countries, it should be less of the state involved and more of private people. You see, whether it's a Nigerian dealing with an American or is somebody from Ghana dealing with a French country, when it's two private parts dealing, chances of being subsidiary or colonized are always less. It is when in the state doing it on behalf of people that those risks are there.
Really? All right, let me hold your thoughts for now. You're watching Africa Today, and we've been looking at China's bilateral relations and growing influence in Africa. Welcome back. China's importance to Africa is as much about what it builds as what it buys. Bilateral trade volume has increased from $11 billion in 2000 to $211 billion in 2013, a phenomenal increase within 40 years. Well, Haywire still joins me via phone, and I need him now to share his thoughts on this. Now, let's look at reactions with regard to complaints that Africa is always at the receiving end of low service delivery or substandard goods, and also exploitation of substandard goods from China. How do you react to this?
I would say if you look at China 20 or 30 years ago, you can make a similar argument about the Chinese economy, right? So they focus on labor-intensive production. They're at the lowest part of the value chain. But look at what China has done in the last 20 years. They successfully moved up the value chain. They invested more in research and development. Now we are talking about export of sophisticated products. So I think there's a misconception about why countries may be trapped in the lower parts of the value chains. It is important, however, to think about what kind of economic policies that should be implemented in order to take advantage of the engagement of the value chains, so that the economy can gradually move up the ladder.
So, but beyond trade and investment now, what role can China play on promoting good governance and democracy in Africa?
So this is a very difficult question to answer, but I would say different from the West. Chinese investors, whether they are coming from the private sector or from the government, they go to Africa mostly for profit. All right, so they have a business mindset. They're not thinking about rule of law or democracy or not even human rights sometimes. But you can argue this kind of investment is bad because it is not promoting those kind of good institutional development. But think about that, right? Once the economy can take advantage of these economic opportunities, over time the size of the middle class will expand. And when you have a sufficiently large middle class, it will be good for democratic development. This is what we have seen in other countries as well.
Professor
So directly, I don't think there is any positive effect on democratic transition.
All right.
But over time, hopefully the economic benefits will kick in and affect those aspects of the country.
All right, so it seems Professor Killer seems amused here, but let's hear your thoughts.
Well, I mean, asking China to, help promote governance and democracy is like asking Nigeria to export snow. What are we talking about?
Really?
They don't even have it themselves. I mean, China hasn't got it. But really, in 2017, going to 2018, It's time for African countries to stop looking for good governance and democracy from others.
Really?
They've created enough middle class, enough graduates, enough exposed people, so many of them on Twitter and internet, to be able to fight for and promote and enhance good governance and democracy by themselves now. That is one thing to look at. So, Africans just need to wake up and, and stand up to reality and take our destiny in our hands. The other thing is that for some standard things, it is not wishful thinking or, doing smiley faces to China that will not allow them, that will stop them from bringing substandard goods to Africa. It's regulation. If China had the chance, if Americans had their way, manufacturers will make substandard products. I don't believe in the innate goodness of man. Man was born out of sin and he thrives in corruption. People tend to be bad. It's regulation, certainty of the law, that impedes them from doing certain things. If we have porous borders or corrupt officials or shallow leaders that cannot set standards, we are going to get substandard products anywhere in Africa, anywhere in the world indeed. There's nothing you can do about that. The only way not to get substandard products is to have good regulations, but also to think about the cost. You see, because let's be very realistic about this. I speak like a strategist now. Whilst we might sort of morally or aesthetically condemn substandard products, I look at a country like Nigeria and indeed some other West African countries, and I've noticed that because of substandard products and the low prices China has brought, a lot of people have had access to things that if they were buying the quality one, they might not have access to at all. So there's a mentality of saying you're buying a substandard bulb or plug, which might not last more than a month, but because of cash flow, and this is economics.
Yeah.
So if you're buying a good one, it's going to last you for 3 years.
Indeed, yeah.
But you cannot afford the one for 3 years now, so you buy the one for 3 months. Then in 3 months' time, you buy another one. So we sort of need to sit down as citizens and policymakers to say, what kind of country do we want? You see, to avoid that elsewhere, I think of Norway and some other countries, to avoid substandard product, they've made the law, but they've also made it accessible to people, either by finance, either by raising minimum wage, either by creating other facilities which does not leave the citizen alone. So we have to think what we want to do.
All right, let's look at the issue of security now. What do you make of motives following the construction of China's first overseas military base in Djibouti? I'm talking to you now, Professor Killer.
Yes. What do we make of it? The same thing. Once you're big, you have money, you start doing things like build a military base outside.
Some would say it is more of an imperial power.
It's all part of it. I mean, what was it when America was doing it? It's just, when you become a world power, you do those kind of things. Why? Because you can. That's my joke to my students. Sometimes I say, I take the question and they ask me why. And I say, because I can.
Yeah, right.
It's just a bit about that. But when you're a world power, you exert your influence, not only in manufacturing or innovation, you exert it in economics, in finance. There's subtle difference between economics and finance, but it's there. You exert it in cultural advancement and also military stance. Because if you do not have all these things, you're not a true world power. So from a very sort of rational point of view, it's logical that China will advance that way. It is other people that has to think, what are we doing with our own lives? It is not to preach to China or pray to them, People need to think about themselves, as it were.
All right, and let me turn that question to you, Hey White Tang, because from what Professor Killer says here, it's really, really dicey, the China-Africa relations. But let's look at the security situation that I threw to a question to Professor Killer. How would you react to that China's motives to, construct its first military base in Djibouti, knowing fully well that some see it as an imperial power?
This is the first military base that China established in Africa. It would be very hard for me to conjecture the underlying motives. However, we know that Chinese government has been trying to push its One Belt, One Road initiative. So it is very clear that they want some security to protect the international and investment routes in Africa, in other areas in the world. So to me, based on my research on China in the last 10 years, I feel that a lot of these policies and changes that China is making in the rest of the world is trying to basically expand the market for Chinese companies, including its own state-owned enterprises. However, is there any political motive behind this? I'm not sure. But based on just military base built in Africa right now, it's very hard for me to conjecture what would happen in the next decade.
So what happens 10 years from now between China and Africa? What would you anticipate would happen next? Are we still seeing more of a cooperation, bilateral relations?
Yeah, so I think there will be more and more economic cooperation. There will be certainly backlash in Africa in the sense that people may be worried that the Chinese are taking over a larger part of the economy. They are replacing workers in certain countries in the continent. But by and large, I think we are going to see a larger volume of trade between China and Africa. There will be more investment coming from China, perhaps in the non-raw material sectors. Africa, in general, will move up the global value chain, similar to what China has done in the last 2 decades. There will be investment moving manufacturing process from China to Africa, given that Africa has better and more promising demographic dividends, given that Africa is in general a continent with faster growth and growth potential in the long run. Don't forget, the entire world is basically aging. The only exception is the African continent that seems to have an increasing young labor force that is going to basically fill in the gap due to aging economies, including China itself.
All right, let's leave it for now. Thanks a lot, Wai Tang, Assistant Professor of International Economics, Johns Hopkins University in the United States. Thanks a lot for your contributions on Africa today. So now let's wrap up the show with you, Professor Killer. Yeah. Now, how well can Africa begin to maximize, its relationship with China so that it doesn't seem to be on the other side where, it's more of a receiving end, but not productive?
Well, there needs to be a vision. African leaders and policymakers need to sit down, look at reality, and say, what do we make of it? Reality is in 10 years' time, Africa is going to be more indebted to China.
Yeah.
Because when we talk about increase in volume of trade and everything, is more debt. The question is, what do we want to make of this situation? Chinese relationship with African one has a unique thing. Unlike the Western one, China is one partner that brings money, buys, sell, brings technology, but also brings human labor. Mm-hmm. And it's it's a very vertical thing. They bring from CEOs to manual workers. So maybe Africa needs to sit down and think of immigration policy. I don't believe in stopping people from moving. I believe in asking for more. If I was in charge of a policy for an African country, I would negotiate Africans going to China as well for the things, just the way they're coming here. I would look for reciprocal and bilateral relationship in everything that you do with China. I would target with human development. I would target with racism standards. Then I would do some kind of cultural alliance with Africa, with China as well. I mean, China is great for opera, beautiful paintings and design. If you go to Beijing or some other part of China, beautiful things to see.
So we should be able to learn from such
We should be able to get those things. But we should be able to bring Chinese museum here. I even want more of China. But by the same token, get African museums in China as well.
Yeah.
Then Africa needs to find a way to get into the Chinese market. But it's not just by selling crude, because if you sell something crude, you earn very little. There's a theory about the complexity of economics. The more complex your product is, the more you're likely to make out of it. So Africa needs to refine this. And we have things we can look at, some very simple ones, from arts to manufacturing, to looking for things that are unique to Africa, and then design it in a way that can be exported as well. So so what do I wish for Africa? I wish for leaders who sit up, put their thinking hat on, and then think about it and plan, and not just be at the receiving end. Otherwise, it's going to be disastrous.
And we hope it doesn't get disastrous at that time. But let me thank you very much, Professor Killer, Center Director at the Center for International Advanced Studies and Professional Studies as well. Thanks a lot for your contributions on the program. Well, in a world where no nation can survive in isolation, China-Africa relations comes with great potentials and the need to move from an unbalanced marriage of convenience to a partnership based on win-win cooperation. Beyond China, the continent must also take advantage of other international opportunities to grow relevance and strengthen independence with the building blocks of prosperity. And that is our package for today. But don't forget to join the conversation as usual on Twitter at TVC News NG, and follow me for updates around Africa at Esther TVC News. Until the next one, I am Esther Mokbariola, and always remember, change starts with you.